Today, as part of this series of Linnean Lens, I'm delighted to welcome Andrea Hart. Andrea is Library Special Collections Manager at the Natural History Museum, where she has been for at least, I think it's 27 years. So a very long time. And she sits on the Collections Committee of the Linnean Society, and she's also one of our trustees. She's recently collaborated with Andata to publish a book on Elizabeth Gould entitled Birds of the World, which I have here, and Andrea has kindly donated to the library. Here we go. Sorry, I can't see my camera because of my notes. There we go. So it's entitled Birds of the World, The Art of Elizabeth Gould, and she's going to talk about the wondrous birds of Elizabeth Gould, using and showcasing some of the stunning works from our collections. Before I pass on to her, just a word about our setup. As you can see, she's sitting next to me. We've got an external camera, some books that we're going to show you. So please bear with us if the technologies goes wrong at any point. That's it. That's it from me for the moment. So over to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Right, so delighted to be here today at the Linnean Society and to dig a little bit into some of the books that are here, but obviously to talk about Elizabeth Gould. So if I now can get into that, we can kick off. So unlike botanical art, the art of ornithological illustration has long been primarily associated with male artists who include John James Audubon, Edward Lear and Archibald Thorburn. Among the few female artists in this branch of natural history, which includes Sarah Stone and the French artist Pauline Nip, there is one woman whose contributions helped break the mould of bird illustration, but due to her early death and perhaps overshadowed by her husband's status, the significant contribution to and the scientific and artistic legacy of Elizabeth Gould made to this area of visual art has not always been recognised. Although familiar with the Gould monographs due to their presence in the zoology rare book collections in the museum library, some of which you can see in the slide, I first came across Elizabeth Gould when I was researching my Women Artists book back in 2013. There we go. I'll just show that, sorry. A project which happily allowed me to dive into the original artwork collections preserved at the museum, which span across the breadth of natural history and identify original artworks that had been created by women. At the time, there were only 2 of Elizabeth's original artworks in the collections, and they were bound in a volume of original drawings that were collected by Sir William Jardine. The caption which accompanied her drawing in my book reads, as is on the PowerPoint. That book was published a decade ago and was my first. Elizabeth was one of over 120 women artists I identified in the collections, and so my research on her admittedly was not as in-depth as it could have been. That there were only 2 drawings of hers in a bound volume meant that they were also not selected in the accompanying exhibition in the museum's Images of Nature gallery, another reason why more in-depth research was not pursued. My interest and attention in Elizabeth grew in 2018 when the museum was permanently allocated a number of volumes of historical original drawings through the Arts Council's Acceptance in Lieu scheme. One of the volumes allocated was the original drawings of Mr. and Mrs. Gould. Carefully turning through the bound pages of the artworks, it's immediately clear which drawings are those of John's and which are those of Elizabeth's. John being more of a draftsman, whose drawings are not refined in detail but focus on artistic and placed compositions, coloured much of the time with chalk, but with the most beautiful fresh graphite lines which delineate the birds depicted. I quite like this one of the toucans there because they look a little bit like angry birds. This is in direct comparison with Elizabeth's refined drawings of birds, individual subjects, mostly without elaborate backgrounds, but careful details in the definition of feathers, heads, and feet. As you can see from the 2 drawings here, and also the preliminary drawings and sketches of John's that are also held in the Spencer Library in Kansas, he is clearly not as skilled as Elizabeth or his subsequent artists, but was an accomplished draftsman who would provide Elizabeth a rough sketch of his vision of the birds in the background for their plates. Elizabeth would then use the sketch as a guide and add further details in watercolour from a close study of the subject. Were I to rewrite the caption today, it would read more like this. Elizabeth Gould was crucial to the success of her husband John Gould's lavishly illustrated books on birds of the world. She created over 600 lithographic plates for their publications and provided the illustrations for her husband's work on Darwin's finches, etc. You can read the rest. In hindsight, I would have also paid more attention to her birth and death dates, 1804 to 1841, and appreciated that she was just 37 when she died. I would have also learned that during her short life, she gave birth to 8 children, of which only 6 survived to adulthood, that she was instructed in her drawing and lithography by Edward Lear, and that she allowed herself to be separated from her youngest children to accompany her husband on an arduous 2-year voyage to Australia, during which time she would have another child. What I did manage to get right, although possibly by default rather than by design, because as the illustrations in the Women Artists book were grouped by subject, is that she shares the double spreads in the book with Sarah Stone, who outlived Elizabeth. She lived until she was 84, but along with Elizabeth, they are 2 of the most outstanding women ornithological artists of their time. So when the museum was approached, Museum Publishing, I should say, was approached by Prestel to publish a book on Elizabeth Gould. It was an opportunity to pay homage to an amazing woman and celebrate the art she created and to share her legacy with a wide audience. This opportunity also meant I was able to work with Anne Datta, who Isabel mentioned earlier, the former Natural History Museum zoology librarian, great friend and colleague, whose knowledge of Elizabeth, but also John Gould, because of the extensive research she's taken on the Gould correspondence collection that is also preserved in the museum library, is unsurpassed. Having to look through all the Gould folios to select images for inclusion in the book was not the worst job in the world, and neither was working with Hein van Grauw, senior bird curator at Tring, who kindly identified all of the 200 plus birds we featured in the book to give them their current, common and scientific names. So who was Elizabeth Gould? The relative obscurity of the life and work of Elizabeth Gould is largely due to its sparse documentation, especially that relating to her early life. What is known of her exists in a collection of original letters that are now preserved in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, that were presented by Alex Chisholm on behalf of the descendants of John and Elizabeth and were taken to Australia in 1939. His book, titled The Story of Elizabeth Gould, was published in 1944 in a print run of only 350 copies, but it contains transcripts of all of Elizabeth's letters. So Elizabeth, we have a picture of her here, was born Elizabeth Coxon on the 18th of July, 1804 in Ramsgate, Kent. Elizabeth was the 6th of 9 children. However, sadly, not unusually for the time, her parents lost 4 daughters and a son as infants. Of the 3 sons who survived to adulthood, her 2 brothers, Stephen and Charles, emigrated to Australia in 1827 and 1834, respectively, where they bought land and farmed in New South Wales. All the Coxon children received schooling, but in the early 19th century, systematic instruction did not exist for girls as it did for boys. Education for a middle-class girl was not intended to prepare her for a career, but for marriage, the raising of children, and management of a household. The consensus of those who have written about Elizabeth is that given the conventions of the period, she was well educated and probably homeschooled by a governess. Elizabeth would eventually find employment as a governess, one of the few paid positions available to middle-class women in the early 19th century. With Ramsgate offering limited job opportunities for men, let alone women, taking such employment might have become a necessity. Excuse me. I think I'm okay. Yeah. Let me have another mouthful of water. Sorry. It might have become a necessity if her family were unable to support her as an unmarried daughter. Alternatively, it might imply that Elizabeth held ambitions for a more fulfilling life, which meant leaving her hometown for London, which she did, and was there she met her husband, the businessman, publisher, and obsessive bird collector, John Gould. John was from a humble background. His father was a gardener at Windsor Castle, but he soon gained a reputation as an expert taxidermist in the early 19th century, working for some of the leading scientific establishments in England, including the Zoological Society of London. After meeting in London, they married on the 5th of January, 1829, both aged 24. According to Lambourne, their personalities complemented each other. Elizabeth was calm and cultured, while John was assertive and energetic. We know that John Gould undertook his science and business by means of an extensive correspondence. However, despite significant collections of extant letters in the Natural History Museum, the Mitchell Library in Sydney, as previously mentioned, and other repositories in the UK and the US, they contain little information about their married life. Elizabeth and John were born during a period that saw great scientific, industrial, and societal change across the globe. Increasing exploration and a growing interest in the describing of birds of the world during the late 18th and early 19th centuries saw the emergence of ornithology as a Western scientific discipline. This meant that alongside scientific descriptions and observations of the physical and behavioural aspects of avian species, the art of ornithological illustration started to take its place alongside its botanical counterpart, which had previously dominated natural history studies. Coupled with the development of printing techniques to allow for finer details to be achieved, particularly moving from woodcuts of Renaissance books to engraving and lithography, many zoological illustrations, especially those in the early 18th century, also became splendid examples of fine art. So neither the Coxon nor the Gould families are known to have any artists or connections with the art world. I'm going to cough again, sorry. Oh dear. But during the period in which Elizabeth was growing up, watercolour painting became a popular hobby, considerably eased by paint manufacturers who had found ways to make cakes of paint by binding pigments with gum arabic that were readily portable. Paper manufacturers rose to the demand and produced greater quantities of drawing paper of different grades and sizes. One of the popular subjects for women was flower painting, particularly in Europe, with the Dutch flower painting from its beginnings in the early 17th century to its peak in the late 18th century. For many, it was a hobby, but for others, it was a vocation, allowing an income either from teaching or book illustration, particularly botanical ones. Fewer women, however, took up painting animals, and it is unlikely that Elizabeth would have become a bird painter had she not married John. To develop her artistic skills, Elizabeth was probably already going into the Zoological Society's museum on Bruton Street. From their lodgings, it was a short walk when John would call her to paint new specimens arriving from Europe and further afield, in addition to the overnight casualties from the zoological gardens or donations from supporters of the Society. The museum also served as Society's administrative headquarters, where senior staff, including the Secretary Nicholas Viggers, would regularly be in attendance, as well as fellows who visited to see the progress of their newly formed society. The presence of Mrs. Gould, a young lady working in a professional capacity, would have been most unusual for the period. Examples of Elizabeth's early bird paintings dated 1829 show that at 25 she was already an excellent draftswoman, working with direction from her husband and working with precision, handling paints and patterns, applying watercolour over pencil outlines and meticulously colouring the plumage and drawing the bird life size or to scale as the mounted specimen or flattened skin was propped up in front of her. Most species could not and were not observed in real life, and even fewer in their natural habitats, so on occasions the resulting drawing could appear rather unnatural. The newlyweds initially lived in rooms behind John's workplace in Bruton Street near Regent Street. Almost immediately, Elizabeth fell pregnant with their first child, John, but he died in infancy in October 1829. Their sorrow would grow with the death of John's father 2 months later, but they would welcome a second son, John Henry, in December 1830, and a third named Charles. However, he died in infancy in October 1832. Life went on. Sorry. Oh dear. Let me see. Life went on, and hopefully this presentation will do too. And with John employed at the Zoological Society and at the forefront of this developing science and receiving specimens from all over the world, many of which were new species, it is not surprising that his business mind turns towards ornithological publishing. Plans for a book commenced no sooner than had the Goulds moved into Broad Street, as on the spur of the moment, John hatched the audacious idea of publishing a book that would broaden zoological interest, thanks Elizabeth, in species on a global level, showing diversity of species, describe species behaviour as well as taxonomic characteristics, and be illustrated with hand-coloured plates, regardless of how many specimens not having previously been scientifically identified. Now aged 26, John was by no means a wealthy man and had to produce this first book on a shoestring budget. In Elizabeth, he had an equal partner as artist to complement his written descriptions, but no funds were available to pay a lithographer. When John confided to Elizabeth his idea of a publication of a work on the Himalayan birds illustrated with lithographs, she is reputed to have asked, "But who will do the plates on stone?" "Who?" replied her husband. "Why, you, of course." So I thought I'd speak a little bit about lithography before we then start looking at some of the volumes here. in the library. Lithography is a printing technique based on the antipathy of water and grease, in which an artist draws on a block of fine grain porous lines grown with a greasy material, so then ink, crayon or chalk. The process was invented in 1798 by Alois Seinfelder, a German amateur printer, and it spread to England in the early 19th century, and one of the first and arguably finest to set up a lithographic printing press in Great Marlborough Street, just a few streets from the Gould's house, was Charles Joseph Halmandel. In 1824, Halmandel published his Art of Drawing on Stone, in which he described in minute detail every stage in the lithographic process. He was also ready to help clients master the process by welcoming them into his workshop and offering advice. It is probable that this is where the young artist Edward Lear developed his learning of the process. Lear, at the age of 18, had just started to publish his own work on parrots, but unable to afford to employ someone to make the prints from his drawings, he taught himself the lithographic process in order to cut down his expenses and give him total artistic control over the finished print. Lear would develop an expertise in the technique, and as Elizabeth would not have possessed any previous knowledge about the technique, which required time and skill to learn, Lear instructed her, which enabled the Gould volumes to be published at a lower cost than copper plate or steel engraving. Lear's role in teaching Elizabeth was therefore crucial in showing the way to achieve John's dream. Without the employment of Lear and of Elizabeth's learning and mastering the process, the Gould folios would never have even begun. This is evident by Lear writing on hearing of John's death as he passed in 1881. In this earliest phase of his bird drawing, he owed everything to his excellent wife and to myself, without whose help in drawing he had done nothing. But the Goulds would also face additional emotional pressures. Throughout her first pregnancies, Elizabeth had been hard at work producing the plates for their first publication, A Century of Birds, which we'll have a look at very soon, towards the end of which, in 1833, she lost her father. That year, too, Elizabeth almost died in childbirth. In a letter dated 19th of April, 1833, Lear wrote to George Combe that Mrs. Gould went into premature labour with her fourth child, during which she nearly died. At the time of writing, she is still in imminent danger and is to be for a long while incapable of lithography. This quote was taken from Gordon Sauer, who had a lifelong even devotion to the study of John Gould. He goes on to write that Lear was engaged to help with the European birds in her place. Lear's assistance as an ornithological artist would become very much needed, as Elizabeth and John had another son in January 1834 named Charles. Their first daughter Eliza was born in 1836, with a second Louisa in 1837. It's not possible to know the effect of Elizabeth's pregnancies on her long-term health, but without the benefit of modern medical care, it is likely to have been significant. The 8 children she would eventually have, 6 of whom survived to maturity, would no doubt have added a huge emotional burden to the physical demands of pregnancy and childbirth. And working with heavy lithographic stones, which John hired from Halmandel, was also physically demanding. It was painstaking, back-breaking work, as involved leaning over the large stones for large periods of time. Lear himself found the work unbearable, referring to it this lampblack and grease work. The Australian Museum, interestingly, has got an excellent online piece on lithography, with the process of it being demonstrated using some of the original Gould stones. So if anyone is interested in taking a look at that, I would strongly advise or suggest that you could. For 12 years, up to her untimely death, Elizabeth's artistic talent and John's knowledge of birds, they shared a most beautiful and artistically significant partnership, which resulted in the production of some of the most lavishly published books on birds ever created, becoming known as the Gould Folios. And with only a few women mastering the art of lithography, it makes Elizabeth's skill and legacy even more noteworthy. So, Gould folios, they were all filled with hand-coloured lithographic plates, and as just described, were very labour-intensive to produce. Published in limited editions, they were sold to wealthy naturalists and institutions by subscriptions. And it took many years, as you can see, to produce a single title. At the time, Elizabeth's skill was also growing in esteem. Nicholas Vigors, in a presentation to a meeting at the Zoological Society of London on the birds of the Himalayan mountains, named a new species, Cineris gouldiae, to honour, as he wrote, the accomplished artist Mrs. Gould, who executed the plates of these Himalayan birds. So at that, Isabel and I are now going to attempt to show you some pages from The Century of Birds by Mrs. Gould. So I am going to stop sharing. I am going to stop sharing. There we go. And here is that book. So as you can see, we had a quick look at these yesterday, beautifully bound by the Linnean Society, weren't they? So these were received to the Linnean Society. So quite a heavy book binding here, but very lovely, ornate gilt edgings, end papers as well. And I think Isabel's going to turn initially to, here we have the title page. And then you've got the dedication here as well to William IV and Adelaide. And then the preface here at the bottom, I believe, let's look. I think on the next page. Oh, where does he relate to Mrs. Gould? Anyway, I think he does thank his wife in this, but if we keep turning through, there's quite a lot to read, isn't there? We were quite interested yesterday looking at this list of subscribers, because what you can see here, I don't know how clearly, are many of the subscribers were fellows of the Linnean Society. So those are those that have got FLS after their name. And then looking through this list, when you get to L, which will be on the next page, I think we've got there, the Linnean Society itself subscribed, didn't it? So this is a copy that the Society specifically, as you say, subscribed to and would have wanted to hold in its library collections. So as I let Isabel just leaf through the volume for a while. Yep, she's not on me. So this Century of Birds, it was published between 1830 and 1833. Elizabeth would eventually produce 80 plates for this volume, which had 102 birds figured. The list of subscribers, as you were just saying, included Audubon, many fellows of the Linnean Society and the Linnean Society itself. And as you can see from the composition of the pictures, the foregrounds are pretty minimal and usually uncoloured as well. We think this was to save money. So basically the colourists that would have been colouring the lithographic plates after Elizabeth's proof, they would have just focused on the birds. But you can see the outlines, the detail, and considering this was one of the, or was the first book that they did go on to publish even, it's absolutely beautiful. The other thing that you hopefully will come through in the viewer as well are the colours. I would say that these plates are pretty much in pristine condition with incredibly vibrant coloration. So this volume happily did attract quite favourable reviews, including one in the Edinburgh Journal of Natural and Geographical Science. So we can continue to look through, or
or we can move on to the next one.
Okay, so I'm going to let Isabel very carefully close the volume. If I can... That might be a little bit of it. Try the next one. So while the century was still in progress, they did start another much larger work in 1832, which was The Birds of Europe. And I've got some images from that one to show, which would take 5 years to complete. In this series, which comprised 448 plates published in 22 quarterly parts, the birds became more lifelike, and in a few plates were shown attempting to catch insects or in flight to add movement. This was not such a difficult task, as many of the depicted species or closely related ones were found in England. Although Elizabeth would have been familiar with some of the European birds, her drawings were again done from specimens. Her foregrounds remained simple, mostly branches with leaves and an occasional flower or fruit, which were now coloured. Patches of land or water and cliffs are introduced in some. Another difference in these plates is that there might be more than one bird shown, a pair of adults or an adult and a juvenile. Sharing the work with Elizabeth, Edward Lear completed many of the larger birds, contributing 68 plates. This association with Lear also allowed Elizabeth to develop in skill, and together they significantly raised the standard of ornithological illustration. With The Birds of Europe, in the very early stages of production, John started on his next publication in 1833, and this time he focused on a single bird family, the toucans. which Lear was again employed to share the making of the plates with Elizabeth, who was continuing to juggle motherhood and working as an artist. Lear had a difficult relationship with John Gould, who was 8 years older than Lear and at times spoke harshly of him. However, Elizabeth, with her caring nature, would have had sympathy for the socially awkward young man who suffered epilepsy and extreme short-sightedness. So we're going to head back to Isabel because we have the toucan monograph here. So again, you can see a very ornately bound volume here. Unfortunately, the front board has become detached, and happily this volume is also on the Adopt Lynn book scheme, which I'm sure we'll later can talk a little bit more about. But as you can see, again, beautifully bound, slightly shorter list of subscribers in this volume. So this monograph of the Rhamphastidae, or family of toucans, was published between 1833 and 1835, with Lear's completing 10 of the 33 plates that are present. Elizabeth rose to the occasion and produced some very lively compositions, which we will get to. Here we go. There's one beautiful one there.
Yeah.
Some of them almost up to Lear's quality. This is all the more remarkable as very few of the subjects can have been seen in captivity, and most were based on 1 or 2 specimens sent to Gould for identification. So as Isabel goes through, oh, that one's got a cherry. What's also interesting about this as well is you see the toucan's tongues, which are feathered. So all of these details being very carefully picked up by both Elizabeth and also Edward Lear. I don't know if they're able to see so much at the bottom, but the acknowledgements.
It's not going to come through the camera, but yeah. So this, sorry, I don't know if they can do that.
Just unmuting myself. This here says drawn from nature and on stone by J.N.E. Gould.
Which is an interesting point because even though in the Century of Birds, all of the plates are credited to Elizabeth, from the toucans onwards, they all became J.N.E. Gould. So it's not always known if John, or how much, I suppose, effort John put into the plates and how much it was Elizabeth. But Elizabeth certainly did all of the drawing onto the stones. What you'll also see, but maybe not so much in detail, that none of the plates have got numbers in this volume either. So sometimes it can be a bit tricky if you're referring to a plate and you're not sure where it is in the book. But as you can see, absolutely beautiful.
So actually that's Lear.
It's very good. So what Lear was very good to do is he would actually sign the stone, and so because that was on the stone, it would come through when the plate was printed off the stone and then sent to the colorists for coloring. But again, so beautiful colors.
Oh, sorry.
It's a pretty and I believe this one as well, even though the list of subscribers was shorter, the Linnean Society again subscribed to this volume, and then also William Jardine, who I mentioned earlier, he also had his name in the subscriptions too. This one's quite lovely because the bottom one's asleep.
Yes, and actually they have put their signature on the stone there, so it does happen. It says here J.E. Gould.
Yeah. And that was one of the advantages of lithography as well, is because you're using a crayon or a pencil as opposed to etching, you could quite easily write your name onto the stone, whereas it would have been a lot more tricky, I think, to be able to etch into the copper.
But there's a real shine to the paintings. I don't know if it comes through on the camera, but when you turn the pages, it's really, really quite striking.
On my screen, they certainly look to be glowing, I must
say.
Okay, shall we move on? We'll continue. So the toucan monograph was followed in 1835 by a work titled A Monograph of the Trogonidae, or the family of trogons, a small family of attractive, brightly coloured birds with a wide global distribution, which took 3 years to complete. With John's reputation growing, he became accepted in the upper echelons of British society, And as a result, Elizabeth also found herself undertaking work for John's contacts, including illustrating birds for a paper by William Yarrell, which was published in the Transactions of the Zoological Society of London in 1833. The Goulds were not, however, without their critics. During visits to London in connection with his publication of the Birds of America, unfortunately, Isabel doesn't have a copy of Birds of America, which probably is just as well, because it's rather big. Audubon called on John after meeting in April 1835. They agreed to exchange publications. And afterwards, Audubon wrote, "Mr. Gould is a man of great industry. His wife makes his drawings on stone. She is a plain, fine woman. And although these works are not quite up to nature, both deserve great credit." So that was reasonably nice of him, I suppose. Audubon's comments are seen in light of his own working methods. After painting North American birds for 20 years, he published a paper on drawing birds, setting out how he watched them first before laying out their corpses on squared paper to draw them to scale. He emphasized that adding background, including eggs, nests, and nestlings, would show the birds in context with their natural habitat. The Goulds would have to wait years or some years until they went to Australia before they were able to perfect their compositions in this way. And as if he did not already have enough work to hand, while starting to contemplate how he could produce a series which comprehensively covered Australian birds, John, in the meantime, found that he had amassed some interesting birds that did not belong in any of his other publications. So in 1837, he put them in a new title, Iconoxavium, with 18 plates prepared by Elizabeth. She's in there. Elizabeth's growing reputation also found her involved in providing illustrations for Charles Darwin. Prior to his publication on The Origin of Species, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, he had sailed on HMS Beagle during the years 1831 to 36, and on his return deposited the collections he made during his circumnavigation in the Zoological Society's museum. So we're going back to the viewer for our third of fourth titles we're going to look today, and these are individual issues of the zoology of Voyage of HMS Beagle. So here at the Linnean Society, they've got 5 separate parts, so they haven't been bound as one volume, which is rather lovely. So you've got the original wrappers on the front. So I think, Isabel, maybe if we start with the one on your left, that would be a good one. Interestingly as well, we had a quick look through these. Initially, they haven't all been cut at the top of the page, which you can see there. So this is quite interesting in terms of how you can see the paper folding process and printing, and then it comes into the bindings. But thankfully, as Isabel goes towards the back, we can start to see some of the illustrations of Elizabeth's. You see birds on a branch. And as Isabel will go through them, you can then start seeing that these are some of the finches and the beaks in particular, which became very important. So John would provide Darwin with the identifications of a small group of birds from the Galapagos Islands. That's a beautiful, isn't it?
Stunning.
These birds, now referred to as the Galapagos finches or Darwin's finches, played a major part in Darwin's formulation of his theory of natural selection. Darwin later engaged John to write the scientific descriptions of the birds he had collected on the Beagle, and including these famous finches. The plates, I don't know if you can see, but they're unsigned. But in the introduction, Darwin does credit Elizabeth by writing, "The accompanying illustrations, which are 50 in number, were taken from sketches by Mr. Gould himself and executed on stone by Mrs. Gould, with that admirable success which has attended all of her works." So I think
Do you want me to move to the next one?
we can. I think we've got time just to have a quick peek in the second one.
I don't know if this means they were never really used.
We don't, well, not all books in libraries are necessarily being used by researchers all the time. I think that's the great thing. You've got the collections and they're there to be used when they need to be. Or they just looked at them at the pictures because maybe the pictures were more desirable than the text. But here again, these are some lovely ones, but you can see here as well, these 2 finches are on a cactus, and this was the specific I suppose botany or vegetation that you would find these birds on. So what Elizabeth was doing was matching the birds to the habitats and the vegetation that they were found in. You've got a pair there as well. Super. So Elizabeth's work on these illustrations was completed by 1838, but John had not quite finished the descriptions when he took the major and life-changing decision to travel to Australia, believing that it was only by doing so that it would be possible to write a comprehensive book on the birds of Australia and to uphold the reputation he was making in the scientific community. So there isn't time to cover the Gould's voyage to Australia in detail today, but in summary, the Goulds left for Australia in May 1838 to collect specimens with the intention to publish the first taxonomic work on birds of Australia. For Elizabeth, this meant being parted from her 3 youngest children for 2 years, which through her extant correspondence with her mother and cousin, who looked after them, was an incredibly emotional period for her. Her maternal guilt and the psychological trauma evident in the letters she sent to her mother and cousin who were looking after the children. Elizabeth and John only took their eldest son, or eldest child, John Henry, with them, and Elizabeth would give birth to their 7th child in 1839 while staying in Hobart, Tasmania, with only John making it back in time from the field for the birth of his son. After a 20-month stay, during which John observed and collected birds and other animals, they returned to England in August 1840. Elizabeth was clearly relieved and delighted to be safely back home with her children. Following a highly successful trip collecting specimens and observing birds and plants in their natural habitats, almost immediately she set to work drawing and lithographing even plates for the first part of their 7th folio book, The Birds of Australia, which was scheduled for publication at the end of the year. As you can see, Isabel's lined this one up to have a look up in just a second. The following May, John would rent a cottage in rural Egham, Surrey, to take his family away from the polluted atmosphere of Soho. Now in her 8th pregnancy, she completed over, 80 plates before leaving London. These would be the last plates she would lithograph. Sadly, Elizabeth would never see the fruits of her labours. After giving birth to their daughter, I've got goosebumps now, who they named Sarah on the 10th of August 1841, she unexpectedly died 5 days later of puerperal fever. She was just 37. Her death left John a widower with 6 children under his care. She was buried in Kensal Green Cemetery in North London, where John would join her following his death in 1881. So as I've as you can see, we've got a volume of The Birds of Australia, which is really interesting actually, because I've never seen the original boards that were distributed. They're not in the volumes at the museum. And what you'll also see on this title page before Isabel fully turns it over, you can see there by J. Gould, FLS, in very big letters. So as I say, these have got the original boards. They're beautifully, I suppose, delaminating with age, such is the nature of paper boards. But as you can see, folios again, and we've got a real switch up almost of composition here. As I say, only 84 of the 600 plates in Birds of Australia are credited to Elizabeth. And as a result of the stimulation of her trip, her plates have a vitality and attractiveness that is not seen in earlier works. By incorporating more authentic backgrounds, landscapes, flowering trees, and young birds, she created for the benefit of subscribers an authentic record of the then little known Australian countryside. And although she did not live long enough to make more plates, the mass of her drawings of plants and birds would be used as references by Henry Constantine Richter, the artist employed by Gould following Elizabeth's death. What has become evident from the collection of the Gould watercolours acquired by the Natural History Museum in 2017 is the development of her paintings, which range in date from 1829 to 1840, the entire span of her artistic career. In her early works, Elizabeth paintings followed in the tradition of fine late 18th century bird books, attractive but formal plates of birds, mostly in profile positions on stylized vegetations or simple landforms, as we saw earlier. The tight control and relative stiffness of the earliest works ends with a flourish, as can be seen in these plates now, and a loosening up of her technique and a natural feel in this work in particular, which suggests a leap forward in terms of her self-confidence. Her composition also developed in Australia, as this gave her the opportunity to observe and paint the surrounding vegetation and associated birds, the addition of plants greatly enhancing the plates. So I'll leave you leafing through those. Is there anything that stands out, Isabel?
I was just going to show the second. So that's, sorry, I'm on mute again. I don't know.
that was the end of the first kind of set, and then you've got the second board here indicating when part 2 starts. So that's the advantage as well, is that they're all dated. So that's March the 1st, 1841, whereas the first one was December 1st, 1840.
Which is really important in terms of bibliographical
Yeah.
significance, as well, to have those original boards still here.
So we have it in 2 volumes. I can't find the book. Oh, here we go. 2 volumes, and each has, I don't know, 4 parts, I think. Yeah. I'll just show a few more, and then I think you can come to your conclusion, or I can keep turning. I'll keep turning while you come to your conclusion.
Keep turning, because I think it would be nicer to look at lovely plates than my face, probably. Right. So at the time of her death, Elizabeth had contributed over 600 plates to their publications in just 12 years, this output averaging 60 plates a year, or 5 plates a month. The new series, The Birds of Australia, the first comprehensive work on Australian avifauna, was completed 8 years later in 1848, and John will go on to publish 7 further titles, including The Mammals of Australia. Upon his own death in 1881, he had produced the longest series of bird books ever published, containing an astonishing 2,999 plates depicting birds from 5 continents. For Elizabeth, it had been concluded by some that the effect of her prolonged effort took its toll on her health. With Chisholm writing, "The strain was too great. Elizabeth Gould, the greatest woman bird painter in Australian history and the mother of 6 children, died worn out. She was, in effect, a martyr to the science of bird study." An alternative view is that in her artistic work, Elizabeth was as driven as John, striving for perfection and constantly improving her skill, as can be seen as the plates progress over time. What John provided was an outlet for her latent artistic gift. Public recognition of any artist at that time was rare, and it was even rarer for a woman's work to be noticed. By crediting Elizabeth when naming her on the plates, John gave the recognition due to her contribution, although her contribution does not appear on a single title page. In many respects, Elizabeth Gould was a typical Victorian wife, managing a household and raising a large family, but in other ways she broke from tradition and showed herself as a career woman working alongside her husband in the production of their publications. From the few letters John sent his wife while apart from her in Australia, and to those of his correspondence in the wake of her death, his love for her was deep, and her passing affected him profoundly. He would name Pupilla Gouldiae, the Gouldian finch, for her. It's a small, beautiful bird collected in Australia's Northern Territory by John Gilbert. In his dedication, are you liking that one, Isabel?
It's quite a fitting one to end with.
In his dedication of the Australian finch, he publicly acknowledged her contribution to his own life and work. "It is," he says, "with feelings of no ordinary nature that I have ventured to dedicate this new and lovely little bird to the memory of her, who, in addition to being a most affectionate wife, for a number of years laboured so hard and so zealously, assisted me with her pencil in my various works, but who, after having made a circuit of the globe with me, and braved many dangers with a courage only equalled by her virtues, and while cheerfully engaged in illustrating the present work, was by the divine will of her Maker suddenly called from this to a brighter and better world. And I feel assured that in dedicating this bird to the memory of Mrs. Gould, I shall have the full sanction of all who were personally acquainted with her, as well as of those who only knew her by her delicate works as an artist." One could argue that Elizabeth's contributions to the publications was arguably greater than John's, as her illustrations were undoubtedly their major selling point. John, nevertheless, had a designer's eye and was a master at creating the composition of the plates, even if he lacked the skill of his artists in making their finely finished works. As a result, it was his name that would be remembered and become famous beyond the immediate scientific community, with Elizabeth's contribution becoming forgotten over time. We are therefore left to wonder what might have become of this talented and dedicated woman but for her tragic death, or how her continuing support of her husband might have changed both his and their family's future direction. What is known and is becoming more widely recognised is the crucial role she played in the creation of a unique series of publications in her short but eventful life. This could never have been achieved had it not been for her artistry and the remarkable partnership she shared with her husband. We made it.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was brilliant. And I hope everyone got a taste of the books we showed. Apologies, I couldn't zoom in because moving the camera is a recipe for disaster and induces seasickness as well. So I'd rather not. So because I was turning the pages, I haven't really had time to look through the Q&A box. So let me have a quick look, and I might just take them as they come. So Andrea, there's a question from Ruth. Is some of the black paint ink of the birds bleeding through onto the opposite page possible use of iron in the pigments? I think we could see that a lot with the toucans, not so much here, but with the toucans.
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if it would be iron. I think it is quite typical for volumes of this age to have that offsetting effect. So it's not necessarily the iron pigment in the black, but I think without appreciating what watercolors or the makeup of the watercolors that were being used for the printing, it's hard to say. My feeling would be though that if it was iron, it may discolor or have discolored over time, especially if maybe there was any dampness or moisture. But good question, but unfortunately one that I don't know the answer of because I don't know the makeup of the paints or the printers ink that was being used.
Okay, there's a few comments. I might just go through those. First of all, the Giuseppe says the zoology of the beagle and many of Gould's monographs are available online at the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which is true, but if you want to see them in real, please come in. There is also another comment that says, many thanks for a wonderful talk. My dad, Ramsay Mackenzie Dodds, was online and very pleased to hear about Elizabeth Gould, mentoring from Edward Lear, a subject covered in his St Andrews University 2023 PhD thesis, which is entitled Ornithological Representation, a Study of its Relationship with the Visual Arts, Natural Science, and the Principles of Conservation. And there's a few other people that thank you, especially for concentrating on another remarkable woman artist. Elizabeth Gould will not be forgotten. That's the most important things. So on to a few questions. Someone asked, is there any knowledge if the Goulds used any specific books by others as reference or inspiration for their work? And the person is especially interested if there is any contact between the Gould and the Finnish brothers von Wright, who did a series of lithographs containing 180 plates entitled Birds of Sweden from Nature and Drawn upon Stone, which was published in parts between 1828 and 1838.
I wouldn't be able to specifically comment on that, but I think John, being a book publisher, he would have been very aware of all of the publications that were available at the time. And I think also working at the Zoological Society of London with all of the new species that were coming in as well and the new descriptions, I think he would have been aware of what was available for reading. And I think having so many connections as well, as we saw from the list of subscribers as well, that those official publications or publications that would have been available in this particular science, he would have had his, I think, his hands and his eyes on, definitely. But I'm not aware of the Swedish publication, and maybe there might be mention of that in the correspondence to give Gordon Sauer, but also Anne Datta a little bit of promotion here as well. They both experts in the Gould correspondence, so there might be some clues to answer that question within that. But both have published major volume series on that, so possibly there.
Thank you. There's a few questions about the process of lithography, but I'll get to those in a minute. There is a question that says, do we know if any of their children went on to be artists?
Yes, insofar as they think they may have observed their mother drawing in their early years, but none to be, I suppose, commercially successful artists. But I think at least two of the daughters had the ability to paint, and they did do some painting. I think somewhere in the back of my mind, maybe one of the sons did as well. He might have done a study out in Australia, but I would have to double check that.
Thank you. So
it's in the book, though. I must.
yeah, there you go.
That's
need to
where
get
the
it.
answer is.
There's a few questions about the lithography process, and if you could elaborate a bit more. So there's quite a few questions. I'll just throw them in and hopefully you'll remember them. Did the stone etch in the printing process create a line drawing that was later colored in by hand for each copy of the book? And then another question says, who were the colorists? Presumably they refer to original paintings, and where are these paintings now? And I think you showed some of the paintings that are kept at the NHM. So yeah.
So if I can remember the questions, yes. So what the lithographic stone would do is create a black and white print of the drawing, which would then be coloured. So the process for the Goulds, they would have created the black and white line drawing, as was evident in the Century of Birds. Elizabeth would have provided a proof plate for that, which would have then been undertaken by the colorists. John Gould, he used Hull-Mandel for the printing, and then Gabriel Bayfield, I believe the name is, as the colorists that would then do the colouring. But they would then all go back to the Gould's house for quality checking before then being sent out as part of those subscriptions. And then what was the second part of the question as well? Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
There was someone else who were asking who were the colorists.
Oh, so it was a firm of colorists. I'm pretty sure Gabriel Bayfield and Gould used them in all of the publications. So we don't know who their names were. They would have been employed through that company.
And the second part of the question was presumably they referred to original paintings and where these are now.
Well, the museum has some original paintings by Elizabeth Gould, but the vast majority that are extant are in Kansas. So, which have a lot of them have been digitized. They are available online. That's the Spencer Library. So I'd suggest having a look there. How many of the actual original watercolors exist? I don't know.
There's a couple of questions about not birds, but other illustrations. So someone asks whether all the plants and insects in the plates within the birds have been identified.
We didn't look at them for the purposes of the book that we came up with, and I can't remember off the top of my head if Gould refers to them in his taxonomic descriptions in terms of, I suppose, feeding habits and characteristics of the birds. So probably not, maybe, but then how they then were introduced into that, I don't know. But I don't think for the purposes of the books, the insects were identified, but whether or not somebody as another piece of work have already done that. I know with Birds of America, the insects, the plants, they've been very heavily studied, which is a very interesting, I think, way of looking at the Birds of America if you're just not looking at the bird drawings direct. But as far as I know, I don't think that has been done with Gould.
Thank you. And Bob Peck says, thank you for your presentation. Wonderful. Can you speak a bit about Elizabeth's botanical illustrations?
I don't know if I can or not. I mean, obviously, for most of the botanical illustrations, they were there, I suppose, to give a little bit more character vibrancy to it. Whether or not, obviously, with Century of Birds, she wouldn't have been aware, and Gould may not have been aware where you would have found those birds in those different habitats. So, as I said, with the Australian drawings, because she was able to go out to Australia, she had quite a lot of time in the city whilst John went off collecting, that she was able to observe plants and the vegetation around her. So that became a lot more, I suppose, realistic, lifelike. I believe also in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, there is also an album of her plant drawings there as well. So I think she obviously was balancing the two, but we don't know, earlier, her very early drawings before the birds and how much of those exist. But I think definitely when Gould she started working with John, it was the birds that had the attention as opposed to the plants.
Thank you. And there's a final question which I see Will is typing an answer to, but you might be able to you might be able to be quicker. You mentioned a website earlier that goes into the process of lithography. Do you have a link for that?
I don't have a link, but it's the Australian Museum. So if you search for Gould Australian Museum, they've got some really fantastic articles about Elizabeth, about John, about the printing process with some really good pictures. I think it gives you a really good perspective as to what the block looks like, the process, and then also how wonderful it must be to use those blocks, ink them up, and then actually reveal a print off the top of them. So yeah, well worth a look, but Australian Museum.
And Will has indeed provided a link in the Q&A. So before I finish, have a quick look, everyone, if you want the link to the Australian Museum website. And he's even referred to a particular page. Amazing, Will. Thank you. So actually, before I thank Andrea, let me also thank Will Beharrell, our librarian who's been in the background, and Pam Gosh, also in the background, our event manager, who I completely forgot to introduce at the beginning. I realize I also forgot to introduce myself, so my name will remain a mystery to anyone who doesn't know me. Andrea, thank you so much for your talk. It was very instructive. I didn't know much about Elizabeth Gould. I feel like shamefully I hadn't opened many of these books properly, and they're just absolutely stunning. So yes, they're on BHL, but I think nothing beats actually handling them because they're so big, and the painting is stunning. So thank you, Andrea. That was brilliant. Andrea did mention that one of these books does need adoption. If you are interested in adopting Gould's toucans, please contact us. I think Will has put a link to Adopt Lynn in the chat, but otherwise just email us at library@linnean.org. If you are interested in coming in, we have a few events that are going to be on site in the next 2 weeks. First of all, our new exhibition entitled Revolution, Nature in the Time of Change, 1776 to 1848 is now open. It's been done in collaboration with Edwin Rose and Staffan Müller-Wiele from the University of Cambridge. And we are open, it's in the library, and you're free to come in, have a look. Tuesday to Friday, 10 to 5 p.m. On the 14th of July, we have a plant botany walk with our honorary curator of botany, Mark Spencer, which will take place in Rye Harbour. So if you're interested in that, go to our website to book. And similarly, on the 23rd of July, we have a queer ecology evening here at the Linnean Society. And the evening will explore natural specimens from the historic collection that challenge traditional views of nature. So again, everything is on our website. So please do take a look if you're interested. And our next Linnean Lens will be in September, details to come soon. So thank you all for joining. Thank you again, Andrea, for a brilliant talk, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.